Hello and welcome to the Ultimate Nyx Guide. My hope is that by the end of this video you'll have a better understanding of what Nyx does and how to play her. I've mained Nyx since around the time that the Assimilate augment was released, which was in 2016, so I'm hoping that makes me qualified to talk about her in depth. Since she was added all the way back in 2013, Nyx has seen quite a few changes to her abilities, builds and playstyle, and I can confidently say that she's never been better. Despite this, you still don't see too many people playing her these days. I imagine this is because people have grown attached to their nuke and immortality frames. But what if I told you that Nyx can actually fulfill both of these roles, as well as others, herself? Now, you may be asking yourself the question, why Nyx though? Surely other frames accomplish the same goal, perhaps even better. And that's a fair question to ask. Personally, I've never been a massive fan of relying solely on my abilities to get kills. I prefer to use my frame to supplement my weapons, and Nyx fits this playstyle perfectly. I also enjoy playing frames that are multifunctional and less one-dimensional. I don't think a lot of people realise just how much Nyx has to offer. Crowd control, damage boosting, immortality, all parts of a surprisingly well-rounded kit. On top of this, I've always enjoyed playing less popular characters in games. It's usually obvious why the meta characters are popular and see as much play as they do, it's because they're effective. That being said, effective doesn't necessarily mean interesting. Personally, I find it far more interesting to see someone playing a forgotten character than seeing yet another person playing the flavour of the month pick. When I'm playing Nyx, I'll occasionally get people asking for builds and advice because they don't understand how to play her, and I love being able to help with that. So that's why I play her. That, and I like the way that she looks. Her Prime helmet is still my favourite to date, and she has some amazing skins which you'll see showcased over the course of this video. Feel free to rate my fashion in the comments. So let's go over what will be in this video. We'll of course be going over her abilities first, and we'll talk about her augments as we go. I'll explain what her abilities do and how to best use them. We'll then be going over Archon Shards, Arcanes and Auras. Finally, we'll take a look at some builds, including some of my favourite Helminth builds that I've used over the years. Let me also just mention what won't be in this video. Absolutely everything. I've been playing this frame for a number of years now, but I'm by no means claiming to know every detail of her kit, and some things just aren't worth mentioning. If there's anything you think I missed or forgot to cover, please do let me know. In-depth maths. I won't be boring you with a load of technical stuff, we'll keep the maths as light as possible. Off-topic tangents. I could easily go over every Helminth option or every weapon that's good with Nyx, but I want to avoid rambling so I can keep the topic relevant to Nyx and keep the video a reasonable length. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Diving straight in, her passive is Thrive in Chaos, and it grants her 40% primary and secondary crit chance for every enemy within affinity range affected by a radiation proc, up to a maximum of 200% with 5 enemies affected. The radiation can come from any source, including your weapons themselves. Hell, it doesn't even have to come from you at all. If your teammate is going around proccing radiation, you'll still benefit from it. Also, because the range is just your affinity range, this means it will benefit from any effect that increases your affinity range, like Vazarin's Mending Unity, for example. It's pretty niche, but still good to know. Now, it's worth noting that it's not a flat increase like Arcane Avenger, it's multiplicative to whatever the base crit chance is on your weapons, just like mods. You can think of it as adding a second critical delay or creeping bullseye, when it's fully stacked at least. For example, take a gun that has 30% crit chance, add critical delay to the build, that will get you an extra 60%, bringing you to a total of 90%. Add on her passive, and assuming it's fully stacked, that will give you another 60%, bringing your final crit chance to 150%. Overall, her passive is pretty solid, free crit chance is nothing to scoff at. Even if you haven't built crit chance on your guns, it's still technically a damage increase. The only thing I'd say you need to be aware of is using the Incarnum weapons that like to build negative crit like the Felarx or Fenmore, as it will mess with their build slightly, but it's not that big of a deal. Her first ability is Mind Control. Casting this on an enemy will cause it to fight alongside you for the duration, which is a whopping 60 seconds by default. The affected target becomes immune to both damage and status effects, it gains increased threat level and guaranteed radiation procs on its attacks, and finally it also gains a damage increase, 750% at base. Over the first few seconds of the ability, the target will be briefly stunned, and during this period you can attack them to increase this damage boost further, with this HUD element keeping track of the damage increase and remaining duration. The enemy's armor is ignored for the purposes of this, so no need to strip it beforehand, but weak spot damage is taken into account, so try to aim for the head if you can. If the target has any sort of helpful or hindering effects available to them, they will use them to your benefit, but we'll be talking about that later in more depth. Mind control targets also contribute to your passive as long as they're in affinity range, ensuring that you always have at least 40%. This is also Nyx's Helminth ability, and it doesn't suffer any sort of penalty or alteration if given to another frame. The mind control target will try to stay near you and will teleport back to you if it gets further than 60 meters away. Once the ability ends, all damage that was inflicted to the target by Nyx and her allies over the duration of the ability will be dealt to the target in a single burst. The augment for mind control is Mind Freak. This augment is pretty simple. It provides the mind control target with an extra 1000 damage as well as 25% movement and attack speed. Both of these values scale with strength. The extra damage is added on top of the base increase, as well as any increase it receives over the initial 4-second charge-up window. Basically, use this augment if you want to turn the target into a super soldier. So would you believe me if I said this was actually Nyx's most complex ability? This is because of the sheer number of enemies you can mind control and the different effects each one has. There's quite a lot to go over, but we'll start by talking about which enemy types generally make for the best targets. Of course, heavy units like bombards and heavy gunners make for great mind control targets because of their high damage output. Melee units like Butchers and Scorpions can also be good choices. They have surprisingly high damage and they really benefit a lot from Mind Freak as well. Another type of unit worth mentioning is the Summoners. This is any enemy that can summon more enemies like Hayaka Masters or Drak Masters. Mind controlling these types of enemies will make them spawn their normal units, but they'll be fighting for you instead. This is a great way to get even more value out of mind control because you can effectively control multiple units with just one cast. It gets more interesting when we start to talk about Xmas units, however. Whenever you mind control an Xmas unit, they'll use their Xmas effect to your benefit. Most of the damaging ones are pretty obvious, they simply use them to damage their allies. Some of my favourite offensive Xmas units to mind control are Arson, Blitz and Jade Light, because their effects do really good damage. Some of my favourite defensive units are Leech and Guardian, as they're great at keeping you alive. Some of the effects work slightly differently for us than they do for the enemies, however. For example, the Energy Leech Xmas will actually restore energy whenever its AoE hits an enemy. It's not much, it's only 10 energy over 5 seconds, but it can generate a good amount of energy if it's hitting enough enemies. The Leech Xmas will heal you whenever its AoE hits an enemy for quite a considerable amount. You can even use this to heal defense targets for like a lot. Another enemy effect that is altered is that of the Ancient Protectors and Corrupted Ancients. Usually these enemies grant overguard to nearby allies, but when mind controlled they instead grant 90% damage reduction as long as you're within its 10 meter range. It's worth noting that there are certain enemies that, while they can be mind controlled, the maximum duration of the ability will be greatly reduced. This usually applies to mini-boss type enemies like Acolytes and some Sentients, so if you ever mind control something and the duration feels particularly short-lived, that'll be why. When it comes to charging up the target, some weapons are better than others. Generally speaking, you want to use weapons that have high DPS either just by having raw upfront damage or having high fire rate or attack speed. Usually the Incarnum weapons and their adapter counterparts make for pretty good options for pumping the target full of damage. Before we move on, I just want to talk about some smaller, more niche uses for the ability that may not be immediately obvious. One thing that I like to do in excavation missions is use mind control to essentially allow me to carry an additional power cell. Whenever you need to move from one excavator to another, mind control a cell carrier, pick up a cell yourself, and then grab one with your operator. As long as you make the trip with your operator, you can put in 2 cells immediately, and then a third when your cell carrier teleports to you and you kill it, meaning the excavator will instantly be 80% powered. Another small use for mind control that you'll probably get to use like twice a year is in the Razorback fight. Usually this fight requires you to hack bursars, which will then get them to shoot with the Razorback and allow you to damage it yourself. Instead of hacking them, you can mind control them for the exact same effect, saving you a grand total of about 3 seconds. How fun! Her second ability is Psychic Bolts. Upon casting, Nyx throws out a cluster of 6 bolts that automatically seek enemies within 60 meters so long as they're in line of sight. Enemies hit by a bolt will briefly be staggered and lose 80% of their armor and or shields for 11 seconds. Infested units are instead slowed by 20% for the duration. Stripping an enemy's defenses will also bolster Nyx's defenses. If armor is stripped, you'll gain 25 armor per enemy hit for 20 seconds up to a maximum of 1000. The duration gets refreshed every time armor is stripped. If shields are stripped, you'll replenish 75 shields, which will then generate overshields when your shields are full. If a bolt hits an enemy with overguard, the overguard won't be removed, but you will gain a small amount of overguard for yourself. Additionally, when an enemy affected by Psychic Bolts dies, it will release an additional 2 bolts that will seek nearby enemies. Bolts generated this way don't have a refreshed duration, they retain the duration of the initial cast, so sadly you can't send out bolts forever from a single cast, but because the bolts multiply, you are able to continue stripping defenses for as long as the duration lasts. The augment for Psychic Bolts is Pacifying Bolts. Running this augment will increase the otherwise fixed number of bolts from 6 to 9. It will also cause the enemy's hit to stand in place, confused and helpless for 10 seconds. Don't ask me why it doesn't match the duration of the defense strip, I have no clue. It also applies a single stack of radiation to enemies, which means it can stack up your passive. Honestly, this augment is kind of weird. The additional bolts are nice for sure, but forcing the enemies to stand in place when you'd rather have them fighting each other with chaos just seems counterproductive to me. And it's not like you need to make them any easier to kill. They've already lost all their defenses. Having them just stand there feels like overkill. Ultimately, I don't often run this augment, but I'm not going to recommend against it. I'd say try it for yourself and form your own opinion. The most important thing to know with Psychic Bolts is that because the default defense strip is 80%, you need no less than 125% strength to get this to a full 100% strip. In every build you'll see in this video, 125% will always be the minimum amount of strength, and I'd encourage you to do the same for your builds. Later on I'll be showing you the best way to ensure this is the minimum for any build that you make. Speaking of strength, it's a very valuable stat for Psychic Bolts overall. Just look at all the values it increases. Running high strength makes you very difficult to take down regardless of whether it's armor or shields that you're stealing. Any overguard you get is just a bonus layer on top of everything else. The overguard steal is particularly nice in missions where most of the enemies will have overguard, like in Xmas Stronghold Sorties or Bolstered Belligerents Archimedia. Unfortunately, the weakest part of this ability is definitely the Infested Slow. 20% is such a low starting value that you need a ridiculous amount of strength for this to be noticeable. I'd say it's not worth worrying about, and it's certainly not worth building around. What's worse is that this doesn't even extend to other enemies without armor or shields like the Dax or the Fragmented Tide. Psychic Bolts simply doesn't do anything to them. But yeah, it is what it is. Her third ability is Chaos. Chaos creates a Psychic Blast that briefly stuns all enemies within 25 meters and places an illusion of Nyx over them. They also receive 10 stacks of radiation, causing them to fight each other for 25 seconds. And that's it. Pretty straightforward, this one. It does have a little more to it than that, but we'll cover that a bit later. Chaos's augment is Chaos Sphere. This gives Chaos a lingering radius that starts at the maximum range and shrinks inwards over half the duration of the initial cast. Any enemies that enter the area will also receive the effects of Chaos. I used to think this augment was pretty bad, but in recent years I've given it more of a chance, and it's not as bad as I once thought. The biggest issue with this augment is the fact that the ring shrinks over time and only lasts for half the duration. That means that to make this augment work, you need both high duration and range. When you consider that our single biggest source of duration also reduces our range, it becomes a little difficult. It is possible to make it work though. This augment is best used for locking down multiple areas, and I'll show off a build that's designed to do just that later. As I'm sure you know, the effective radiation status is causing enemies to fight each other, dealing increased damage when doing so. 100% on the first stack and 50% on each subsequent stack, up to a maximum of 550% at 10 stacks. Of course, this is great for an ability that causes enemies to fight each other over a wide area. Importantly, the radiation procs won't be overridden by mind control. This means that, where possible, you want to cast Chaos before casting mind control to ensure that your mind control target will be doing maximum damage. Sadly, after the target has been mind controlled, they can no longer be affected by Chaos, so this combo will only work once at the start of the ability. One minor use for this ability is stunning enemies that are capturing interception points, raising alarms, calling for backup, etc. Because Chaos has no line of sight check and causes a brief stun on cast, you can use it to stun enemies out of these animations from a distance, preventing them from finishing their action when you otherwise may not have been able to. Additionally, because Chaos causes enemies to turn on each other, it means that any sort of support units like Shield Ospreys or Ancient Protectors will completely stop assisting their allies, limiting their effectiveness. Like most abilities, Chaos won't affect enemies with Overguard, but the best part is, it doesn't have to. As long as you're hitting their susceptible allies, they'll start fighting them anyway. This is because non-irradiated enemies will consider irradiated enemies hostile and attack them regardless. Finally, we have her fourth ability, Absorb. Casting Absorb will cause Nyx to enter a meditative state for 5 seconds, becoming completely invulnerable, increasing her threat level and absorbing all incoming damage while slowly hovering around. All damage absorbed is channeled into an explosive discharge that detonates at the end of the ability, damaging and knocking down all enemies within range, disregarding line of sight. The explosion radius is 15 meters and scales up to a maximum of 50 meters with more damage absorbed. The base range is affected by range mods, but the maximum range is fixed at 50 meters. Modding for range essentially just means you'll need to absorb less damage to reach the maximum. I should also note that Absorb has damage fall off and does less damage the further away the enemy is. After the explosion goes off, you'll gain a weapon buff and a period of invulnerability for yourself and your robotic companion based on how much damage you absorbed. The weapon buff is additive, lasts for 8 seconds, and is capped at 400%. As for the invulnerability, you'll gain 1 second for every 5,000 damage you've absorbed, up to a maximum of 6 seconds at 30,000 damage. The duration of the buff scales with duration mods, but the duration of the invulnerability is fixed. In addition to absorbing all damage from attacks directed at Nyx, Absorb will also store any damage dealt by your mind control target and enemies affected by Chaos. Let's talk about Assimilate, which is in my opinion her best augment by far. Assimilate changes Absorb from a duration-based ability into a channel. It also allows you to do mostly everything that you can't normally do in Absorb, like using your weapons, casting abilities, and most other things you can do in normal gameplay. Now, as great as this augment is, it's not entirely a press to win button. It does come with a few restrictions. While channeling, you'll drain 6.5 energy per second, your mobility is greatly reduced, being unable to sprint, crouch, or bullet jump, and you can only jump once. The mod description also says the area of effect is halved, but this is slightly misleading. The 50% range penalty refers to a few things. Firstly, the size of the bubble itself is cut in half, although realistically this has very little impact. Secondly, it does affect the range of the explosion, but it only affects the base range, reducing it from 15 meters to 7.5, while the maximum 50 meters remains unchanged. All this means is that you'll have to absorb more damage to hit the maximum. And now we unfortunately have to talk about Singularity. While you're in Absorb, this augment will make you send out a pulse every 3 seconds that pulls in enemies within 15 meters. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that doesn't sound too bad, I can use it with Assimilate. Nope, they're mutually exclusive. Alright, well, I'm sure if I add enough range, I can make it useful. Nope, it's not affected by range. Surely if I add enough strength, it will. Nope, it's not affected by strength. The only use I've ever found for this augment was with an Aquablades build that I made before Nyx got her rework. You'd cast Aquablades, go into Absorb, and then essentially become a blender, pulling nearby enemies into their deaths. It was kind of a meme build, but it was admittedly pretty fun, but that build doesn't even work anymore because Absorb now has a finite duration. This is the only augment that managed to become objectively worse after Nyx's rework. With all the new ways that Absorb has of storing damage, using this augment just means that you're disrupting the enemies, preventing them from shooting at each other and thus losing out on Absorb damage. Also, after the rework, you can move around in Absorb anyway, making this augment even more meaningless. I mean, I guess it's okay if you only care about the grouping, but if that's all you're using it for, you're better off subsuming Ensnare or Pull over Absorb. Pull even has diminished range, but at least it actually scales. You only need one range mod and it already overtakes Singularity's fixed 15 meters. Basically, this augment is hot garbage and I cannot recommend against it enough. Now, it is a Conclave mod, so you can use it in Conclave if that's something you really want to do. I could see it being more compelling over there, but I haven't tested it and I'm not going to because of the fact that I am sane. Most of the time, most of your damage from Absorb will come from your mind control target and chaos affected enemies. Mind controlling a high DPS enemy like a heavy gunner and hitting a group of 20 plus enemies with chaos can easily net you a few million points of Absorb damage. Generally speaking, I find that at least 1 million damage is the minimum amount of damage you'll need to absorb to deal with enemies in most Steel Path missions, the non-endless ones at least. Due to the nature of the ability and Nyx's kit in general, you'll probably find that the amount of damage you absorb varies quite substantially with each cast. Sometimes you'll absorb 100,000, sometimes 100 million. It just depends on how much the enemies feel like fighting each other. To maximise your chances of absorbing as much damage as possible, cast Chaos, trying to hit as many enemies as possible, mind control one such enemy, ideally a priority target mentioned earlier, wait a second or two to ensure the stun from Chaos is worn off, cast Psychic Bolts to increase the amount of damage affected enemies will receive, go into Absorb and try to sit in the middle of enemies. Absorb is the only one of Nyx's abilities that directly deals damage to enemies. All of her other abilities rely on the enemies damaging each other to deal damage. It's also the only one of her abilities that is affected by nullifiers if you step into the bubble. Both Mind Control and Chaos won't be nullified if either you or any affected targets enter a nullifier bubble. For Psychic Bolts, nothing happens if you enter the bubble, but the enemies will regain their defenses if they enter. Now, if you find the Absorb bubble difficult to see out of, particularly while using Assimilate, then I have some solutions for you. Number 1. Make your energy colours black. This is a pretty fire and forget solution as it doesn't require you to do anything after setting it up, but the downside is it will affect all of your other abilities as well, making them harder to see, so I wouldn't say it's the best option. Number 2. Casting Absorb while invisible. This can be useful in situations where you have access to invisibility, but seeing as Nyx doesn't have any inherent invisibility of her own, this isn't that often. It can be quite useful after hacking though if you're running Untraceable on your Parasite. Number 3, my personal favourite, casting Absorb while aiming with a scoped weapon. This will work with anything that has a scope overlay, including the Synthesis Scanner, which means you don't even need to run a scoped weapon in your loadout. This is the option that I go with when I feel like having an invisible bubble. Lastly, I wanted to mention some useful bits of tech that can make you more mobile while running Assimilate that aren't equipped on Nyx herself. There are certain Incarna melee weapons that offer increased mobility as part of their evolutions. Some examples would be parkour velocity from the Praedos, movement speed from the Okina, and even restoring your ability to double jump from the Ruvox. On top of this, you can also run Dispatch Overdrive to give you even more movement speed when you land a heavy attack. If you're going to run any of the weapons I've just mentioned, I'd recommend running Dispatch Overdrive in the Exilus slot if possible. Lastly, there's Amalgam Barrel Diffusion. If you can stomach giving up Galvanized Diffusion, Amalgam Diffusion increases your dodge speed, meaning you can roll more often and further as well. Combine this with some parkour velocity and it makes you pretty damn mobile. Now let's talk about Archon Shards. I have 3 separate Nyx primes to accommodate for all my builds and fashion, and I use the same set of shards on all 3. We'll go over them in order of importance. The most important are these 2 Talforged Strength Shards. The reason we want these is so we can guarantee that Psychic Bolts will always be a 100% defense strip even if we don't have any strength elsewhere in our build. As I mentioned earlier, Psychic Bolts needs a minimum of 125% strength in order to fully strip defenses. Now you may be wondering why I've used 2 Talforged Shards when I could get away with just using 1 Talforged and 1 normal. The reason for this is because there are some builds that will use these 2 mods, Overextended and Transient Fortitude. With these 2 mods in the build, assuming that they're the only mods interacting with strength, you end up with a net loss of 5% strength, putting you at 95%. That's why both shards are Talforged. That extra 5% allows you to dip below 100% after mods, but still make it back up to 125%. Using both of these shards means you can forego Intensify, which is what you would normally use if all you care about is hitting that 125% breakpoint. This frees up a slot for other more useful mods. And if the build does want strength, congratulations, you now have an extra 30%. Go crazy. Next up we have these 2 Talforged Energy Max Shards. Now, these are slightly more personal preference, but I have these in here because I find that certain builds simply don't need that much energy, either because I'm not casting that often or I've built for high efficiency. In those builds, I'll often opt to remove Prime Flow in favour of something more impactful. These shards help make up for the loss of energy, giving me a reasonable amount to work with without giving me a crazy amount that I won't need to use. With just these 2 shards, you'll end up with 375 energy, which is completely fine for a lot of builds. It also means that if you do run Prime Flow, you'll be getting an even bigger energy pool, which is always nice. With both the shards and Prime Flow, you end up with just shy of 800, which is great for builds that run negative efficiency. Lastly, we have this Talforged Parkour Velocity Shard. This is definitely a personal preference. Feel free to put whatever you want in here. I just like the slightly increased mobility myself. This could just as easily be a casting speed shard or one of the energy economy shards. It's really up to you. Moving on to Arcanes. I'll be going over specific Arcanes when I get into talking about builds, but before that I just wanted to mention some Arcanes that Nyx really likes in general. Firstly, and perhaps the most obvious choice, Universal Fallout. Since this received a bug fix a little while ago to make it actually work correctly with Chaos, it's become one of my favourite Arcanes to run on Nyx. This arcane makes it so each radiation proc applied by abilities gives enemies a 6% chance to drop a universal orb when killed. As Chaos always applies 10 stacks, it means that any affected enemy will always have a 60% chance to drop an orb upon their death. The orbs generated from Universal Fallout are twice as strong as regular Universal orbs, each one giving 50 health and 50 energy. The effect is also permanent. Even if the radiation procs wear off, the enemy will still have a chance to drop an orb when killed. Needless to say, this arcane is very good on Nyx. Not just for yourself, but for your team as well. This arcane gives her a really healthy energy economy and is particularly useful in builds with negative efficiency. It's also great for stacking up Arcane Blessing if you choose to run that as well. If you ever find that you don't particularly need anything in your second arcane slot, Universal Fallout will never be a bad choice. Unless you've subsumed over Chaos for some reason, but yeah, don't do that. Next I want to talk about Arcane Avenger. While running Avenger, you have a 21% chance to receive a flat 45% crit chance for 12 seconds whenever you take damage. Flat meaning it doesn't care about your base crit chance, it will always give you 45% added after mods. This one should be pretty clear as to why it's good. More crit chance is never a bad thing, but it synergizes with Nyx's passive nicely, making it even more potent. Despite what the description says, you can trigger this in Absorb even though you're technically not taking damage, which means that if you're using Assimilate, this arcane is going to have very high uptime, and the augment means you're actually able to make use of the added crit while invulnerable as well. Much like Avenger, another arcane that can be triggered while in Absorb is Arcane Agility. While running Agility, whenever you take damage, you have a 60% chance to receive 60% parkour velocity for 18 seconds. This arcane is great for Assimilate builds because this one will actually have a near 100% uptime, and it gives a great boost to your otherwise limited mobility while using the augment. Before we get into builds, I briefly wanted to talk about a few aura mods that are a good choice on Nyx. She doesn't really need any aura in particular, but there are a couple that are above average on her. For most builds, Brief Respite is my go-to. Having this means that regardless of what faction you're fighting, Psychic Bolts will always restore a little bit of shields when cast. You don't even have to hit anything with it, you don't even need enemies on the screen, it's just a great option for safety. Another good option is Enemy Radar. This is useful for knowing enemy positions, so you can hit as many enemies with Chaos as possible. Honourable mention goes to Combat Discipline. I run this in some Assimilate builds to offer a little bit of support to my teammates. Because I'll be spending all my time in Absorb, I won't be losing any health myself, but my teammates will still benefit. Let's dive into some builds, shall we? These first couple are going to be just vanilla Nyx builds, no Helminth abilities. The first is a general use build for missions where you don't need any stat in particular. The second build is focused more on dealing damage with Absorb and being reasonably tanky while doing so. The first build on our list is a great all-round build for general use. It uses the same spread of stats that I find works well with most frames, and it has decent survivability as well. As I said, there's no Helminth abilities or augments in here. I'd have no problem recommending this build to someone that's new to Nyx so they can get an idea of what her abilities do and what her strengths and weaknesses are. Now let's take a look at what I like to call the Battle Nyx build. This build is designed to be firing off abilities as frequently as possible to maximise our damage output with Absorb, while also retaining a similar level of durability to the previous build. I run Mind Freak in this build to really maximise the damage output of our mind control target and subsequently Absorb as well. The idea here is cast Chaos, cast Mind Control, cast Absorb, and then watch everything go boom. I'd really suggest giving this build a go, it's pretty fun. Seeing Absorb store up millions of damage in a matter of seconds never gets old. I find that this build really tends to thrive in solo missions, particularly ones with high enemy counts like Survival. Playing solo means that the enemies won't get distracted by your teammates and whatever they're doing, and they can invest all their energy into shooting at each other instead. Just make sure to mind control one of those high priority targets for the best results. Now, I'll spare you from going over every Helminth build I've ever made because there have been quite a lot. Some of them have been less effective than I would have liked, some haven't worked at all, and others have just been plain bad. So what I will do is share some builds that I've had success with over the years. Just know that I've decided to only include Helminth abilities that actually have some degree of synergy with Nyx's abilities. I could go over Nourish and Raw builds, but let's be real, abilities like that are good on any frame. The following builds allow me to use Nyx to whatever end I need, be that tanking, damage, utility, you name it. Let's take a look at them. This build has been one of my favourites as of late. It gives a great boost to damage as well as good survivability. In this build, we replace Absorb with Null Star, and we're also running its augment Neutron Star. The augment means Null Star will now be dishing out heat procs on top of its usual blast procs. Because of this, we can run Arcane Hotshot. Hotshot gives us 6% weapon crit chance for 10 seconds whenever an ability inflicts a heat proc, stacking up to 50 times. When fully stacked along with her passive, you gain a massive 500% crit chance for your guns. Naturally, we'll be running Arcane Avenger alongside it because it just makes too much sense. Null Star is great for activating and maintaining Hotshot, you'll barely even have to think about it. Even if you lose all your stacks, you can build them back up so fast it hardly matters. You just have to remember to replenish your stars occasionally. Now, there are other options for abilities with heat procs, but none of them compare to Null Star's ease of use, especially when you add in the fact that the stars are giving you up to 75% damage reduction. Combine this with adaptation and you become really durable. This next build is usually my go-to for when I need a tanking build but don't want to deal with the reduced mobility of Assimilate. This build replaces Absorb with Parasitic Armor. Now, I wouldn't say that Nyx has any sort of direct synergy with this ability, but it can still make for a solid build on her. Nyx Prime does have slightly above average shields, so if you have a good amount of strength, you can get a pretty high armor value. In this build, with just Parasitic Armor alone, you end up with just over 5,400 total armor. Psychic Bolts can give you a further 2,300, but it's largely unnecessary. With this much armor, you have 95% upfront damage reduction. Combine this with adaptation and you end up with 99.5, when it's fully stacked of course. Universal Fallout is great for this build. Killing enemies will constantly be healing you, and all the orbs make it really easy to stack up Arcane Blessing for even more max health. As long as you remember to cast Chaos of course. I used to opt for a shield tanking build, which was good, but I found that it would just get destroyed by Infested because their toxin procs would go straight to your health and insta-kill you. The high amount of armor means that this build is less susceptible to that. This build is pretty good, it has a lot going for it. Just keep in mind that you have damage reduction and not complete invulnerability. You unfortunately can still get one shot if an attack does enough damage. 1% of a hell of a lot of damage is still a hell of a lot of damage, and you're still somewhat vulnerable before you have adaptation stacks. For most intents and purposes though, this build works well. Remember earlier when I said I'd show off a build for locking down areas? That would be this build. This build uses Chyrinka Pillar to spread around even more radiation procs. I also run Chaos Sphere for maximum coverage. The idea with this build is to try and hinder the enemy as much as possible by cutting off choke points and setting up a defensive perimeter. Chaos Sphere covers a wide area, while the pillars are useful for more focused area denial around doors and corridors. One of the nice things about this build is that between Chaos and the pillars, you're going to have basically 100% uptime on your passive, so long as there are enemies within range of course. This build really excels at widespread crowd control. Just be sure to watch out for those pesky Xmas units. Next on our list is Gloom. Now I know Gloom builds have been done to death, but Gloom has a nice synergy with Nyx that I don't think a lot of people have considered. Earlier I mentioned that Chaos briefly stuns enemies when cast. The duration of this stun is affected by the enemy's speed. The more the enemy is slowed, the longer the stun will last. As you can see, with this build, the stun lasts for almost a full minute. This build is interesting because it changes the function of Chaos. It's no longer about getting enemies to fight each other, and more about keeping them stunned for long periods of time. So these next few builds fall into a category I'm going to call Assimilate Mobility. These are builds that allow you to get around the movement penalty of Assimilate in various ways in order to better make use of the invulnerability. For all of these builds I replaced Mind Control, but feel free to swap something else out instead. Other than Absorb, obviously. Our first option is Wrathful Advance. This build allows us to teleport around for very little energy and basically no cooldown. It also has the added benefit of increasing our melee crit chance. In fact, with this build, Wrathful Advance and our passive means that all three of our weapons gain 200% crit chance. If you want to, you can really lean into the melee side of things and turn Nyx into an invincible melee Terminator. One thing I would definitely recommend doing for this build would be inverting the tap and hold setting for Curbi in the options menu. This will make it so that you'll perform the teleport just by tapping the button instead of needing to hold it. If you're aiming at an enemy, it will still perform the heavy attack even with just a tap. This setting just makes the ability feel a whole lot smoother overall. Our second option for mobility is Molt. Now, I know what you're thinking, Molt? Why Molt? But hear me out. When you're using Assimilate, you can't sprint, which unfortunately means we can't make use of anything that increases sprint speed. If we could, I'd definitely be using Infested Mobility instead. But sadly, we only have access to buffs that increase our overall movement speed. Molt is one of those buffs. Casting Molt gives you a brief increase to your movement speed, which allows you to up your speed without even needing to sprint. Now, I will admit this build is pretty obscure, but it does what we want it to. Unfortunately, the buff is pretty short-lived, so we need a lot of duration to make it last a reasonable amount of time. And the movement speed buff is on the weaker side, so we need a lot of strength to make it decent as well. This build is a bit of a gimmick, but it is an option, and being this fast in Absorb is kind of fun actually. I'm lumping the next two abilities together because they basically do the same thing. Those abilities are Reave and Vial Rush. Both of these abilities are long-range dashes, the idea is the same between them, they just function and scale differently, so which one you pick is entirely up to your personal preference. Reave's travel distance scales with duration, whereas Vial Rush's scales with range. Reave lets you glide through the air if you aim glide, Vial Rush doesn't cost energy, you get the idea. These are just other options to consider. Each one of these abilities accomplishes the same goal of increased mobility while using Assimilate, just in different ways. I'd encourage you to try them out for yourself and see which one you prefer. And with that, we have reached the end of the guide. Thank you for making it this far, hopefully you've come away from this video with a better grasp of how to play Nyx. A lot of time and effort went into making this, so a like, comment and sub would be greatly appreciated. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section or drop into one of my Twitch streams. I stream Warframe, where I'm unsurprisingly playing Nyx most of the time, but I do play other games from time to time as well. Thanks for watching!